Sometime in the distant past, some prehistoric man or a group of prehistoric people got together and carried this great big heavy log down to the shore of the stream that they lived nearby, and they put that log into the water and found out that it floated. Not only did it float, but they found out that they could actually move it around simply by pushing it with their hands, and it wasn't heavy at all. That was the beginning of the maritime efforts that we find for prehistoric man. Now, how long they played with that log, getting on and off it, and finding out that being on that log, they could move as the log moved, as it floated on the surface, I have no idea. But it didn't take long before they realized that sitting on that log wasn't fun, and they started to reshape the log, and reshape it in one way or another to make it more easily to work with. It may have taken weeks, it may have taken years, it may have taken centuries, it may have taken thousands of years. We don't really know. But I'll get there. By the beginning of the Neolithic period, find that man was already busy making dugout canoes. Now the Neolithic period starts about 8,000 years before Christ. Actually, the Neolithic period is the period which they were leaving the Stone Age and getting to the point where people were gathering together in communities and were doing some farming and not relying solely on hunting and gathering. And they were making dugout canoes like this. Why? So that they could transport from themselves from one place to another in that canoe. This is the Neolithic age. It started about, like I said, to about 12,000 years ago. And we find out from this period, that they were also building canals. Building canals for the purpose of what? For using these canoes, using these methods of transportation for a couple of places, for reasons. These are illustrated a little bit on this next slide. This would be a typical Neolithic community where you see canals, maybe on a main stream, you see things being transported, you see people involved in agriculture. This was sort of the beginning of the maritime efforts that we find in mankind. These are some of the things that we can get from archaeology. We really can't go much further back than finding the dugout canoes and this extensive array of canals. Actually, this idea of moving things over water lasted for a long time. An interesting period in American history is the early 1800s, from what it says here, from about 1917, 1925. There was a canal that was built from Albany to Buffalo. Let's take a look at that canal. I'm going to get a little closer to this thing. Here's Albany. Here's where the canal was built. By getting to Buffalo, they were able to get onto Lake Erie, and from Lake Erie to Lake Huron. From Lake Huron, they could get all the way to Chicago. You got to Albany on the Hudson River from New York City. All of a sudden, New York City and Chicago were connected to each other, and this was an economic boom, both for Chicago and for New York, in having the ability to transport materials over this long distance. This was a beautiful period in American history, and I came across a number of slides that indicated that people made a big thing of this Erie Canal, of taking barge voyages to see things that were being done. Can anybody very quickly tell me in one word what put an end to the Erie Canal? The railroad. As soon as the railroad came, it was not necessary anymore. And taking rails from Albany to Buffalo was not a big problem. As a matter of fact, they didn't even have to go over the Great Lakes. They could go from New York City to Chicago by rail. That changed things. That changed things rather considerably. Now, at this point, it took a long time to think about this. At this point, I'm going to talk about something a little bit different, and that is that people have found this ability to travel. to go from one place to another place. If you were to take a look at the development of society back in the prehistoric times, you'd find out there's a couple of things that were necessary for a group of people to form a society. One, they had to find a place where there was water to drink, because if you don't have water for a couple of days, you're in trouble. And you had to be near land that could be capable of being cultivated in some way, or would capable of maintaining herds of things like sheep and all that. They would find the proper place where they could get the things that they needed. It seems to be a rather typical situation. As soon as they had everything they needed and were being sufficiently supplied with the water and their other needs, what would happen? There were things they wanted that they didn't have. And very often those things that they wanted would not be with them, and what would happen is they would have to travel to get to the things that they want. Probably one of the best examples of that is looking at a part of history, looking at what was called the ancient Silk Road. This was a path, a trail you might say. They went all the way from Italy, all the way into China, all the way into central China. Why was it called the Silk Road? Because the people in Italy wanted silk. They didn't need silk. They could get by without silk, but they wanted silk. And this promoted a rather significant change on the way people thought about a lot of things, is that if you are willing to travel and to move to some extent, you may be able to get at some things that you don't necessarily need, but things that you want. You want to keep that economic idea in mind, that this whole idea of wanting had as much to do with the advancement of the maritime efforts as you might imagine. This next slide illustrates this in a somewhat different way. This shows the area that we're interested in as far as the Bible, as the Old Testament is concerned. Here's Palestine right here. This red line here is what was called King's Highway. The King's Highway starts all the way down here, which I'll mention a little bit later, goes on up through the Aruba Valley, right next to the Red Sea. Notice that's a little bit to the east of what was Palestine, all the way on up to Damascus and even up into Mesopotamia. Why was this so important? Because of what was down here. This starting off place is Ezion Geber or Aqaba. Sometimes it's called Elath. It was right on the shore of Aqaba. I do have a map here that shows this a little bit differently. Here is what we're talking about. Here's Aqaba, right here. That is the beginning of the King's Highway that goes on up here. And it's associated with the Red Sea. Well, if you can get to Aqaba and get on this Gulf of Aqaba, you get to the Red Sea. You get to the Red Sea, you can get to the Indian Ocean. You get to the Indian Ocean, you can go anywhere you wanted. And this is why this was a terribly important part of the development of that part of the world, is they had access to an awful lot more through this King's Highway, in the fact that they were next to a place that was associated with water, which enabled what? The ability to travel and to move things and to transport things without a lot of effort. Here's another interesting slide. As early as the third millennium, that would be about 3,000 years before Christ, sailors from the Mediterranean Phoenician city of Byblos had developed ships whose curved hulls were able to meet the challenge of the sea, and were using these craft to deliver cargoes of cedar wood to Egypt. Over the following centuries, Byblos and other Phoenician cities such as Tyre and Sidon, which are very important, and Beirut were created, and this created an important niche for themselves to transport luxury goods and raw materials from overseas in barques back to the Near East. In other words, if we have a proper map here, this area up here, this is where the Phoenicians were, up in this area, were able to develop a maritime effort that was rather incredible, to say the least, for that part of the world. They had virtually control over this whole Mediterranean area, and they did manage to sail over this whole Mediterranean area. We'll get to a little bit more a bit later on. To the south of this, we get down into Palestine. Here is Phoenicia. This is Palestine. I'll tell you what, if you're looking for the proper map, you won't find it. I can't find a map that would show me just what I wanted. But here is a Palestine. This is that part down here. Phoenicia is way on up over here. The Phoenicians had this ability to do all this sailing. You would think that when they came to the Promised Land, with the whole seashore that we have here on the Mediterranean, that there would be the opportunity for the people in Palestine, for the Israelites to have a maritime effort that was also uncanny. The interesting thing about it is they had practically none. And one of the reasons, in spite of this entire coast, there were at the most maybe one or two places that were able to be used as seaports. One of them is right here, a place called Joppa. You can use it as a seaport. Most of the rest of this coastline did not lend itself to shipping in any way because you couldn't dock the boats. There were no harbors. I think about this in terms of my ancestry and Gretchen's ancestry, the Dutch. The Dutch were very, very effective people in Western Europe. Why? Well, because they got very much involved in maritime efforts very early. Why? Amsterdam and Rotterdam were great seaports, and they were able to ship out from there, and that made them rather significant there. Palestine didn't have them. When I realized this, getting ready for this lecture, I was remembering something that Golda Meir had said. Does anybody remember who Golda Meir was? She was a Jewish woman. She actually came from the United States, but she was one of the first prime ministers of Israel. And she was one time said something about Israel that I thought was quite interesting, and that is this: I wonder why they call this the Promised Land. This is the only area in here that doesn't have oil underneath it. Well, the same thing could be true as far as ports. Up to the north, they had all these great ports in Phoenicia, but they had practically no ports of any sort in this area. Very, very strange situation, but it had an effect on what would happen. When we go to the Bible, we very often will hear mention of Tyre and Sidon. Sidon is one of these places that just is on the border of Phoenicia. Tyre and Sidon were very important Phoenician ports. Tyre is not too far from Palestine. Here's Tyre, here's Palestine. We'll be mentioning Tyre quite a bit, a little bit later on. Here is a map. Don't try to memorize this. There are a couple places in this map that I want to mention. One of them is right here. This is Joppa. And Joppa is in the province of Dan. The other one, if you could see this, ACCO, is up here in the region of Asher. Dan and Asher were two places where there seemed to have been ports that were usable, at least at the time of Deborah. Let me talk about this particular part of the Bible. This is Judges 5. It often is regarded as one of the oldest things that we have in the Bible as far as being able to rely on in describing anything of the history of that part of the Bible. Describing the history in terms of the Song of Deborah. Now, Deborah was a prophetess who lived in Ephraim. And after she had been rather successful in gathering a number of the tribes together and to fight against Sisera, who was a Canaanite king, she celebrated the victory that the Israelites had by this song. Now, this song is very interesting. We won't go through the whole thing, but maybe we should sometime. Go through the whole thing because it mentions 10 of the tribes of Israel are mentioned, and this would have been around 1250 BC. 10 of the tribes are mentioned. I outlined some of these tribes that are actually mentioned. Benjamin is mentioned here, I think Zebulun and Issachar. I've got 2 of them here that are in red. 2 that are also mentioned in a somewhat different way. And it says, Dan, why did you linger by the ships? And Asher remained on the coast and stayed in his caves. In other words, as far back as 1250 BC, there was mention of the fact that both Dan and Asher had seaports that were capable enough to make the people that were in Dan and Asher not participate in this battle against Sisera. I mention this because someday we're going to get back to looking at this particular section, and probably one of the most interesting parts of this whole Song of Deborah is not what is here, but what is not here. There's something that is missing from all these tribes, and I'll tell you right now what it is, and that's the tribe of Judah, and someday we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about the tribe of Judah. But keep in mind that it does not show up in the Song of Deborah, but Dan and Asher do. Why? Because they had seaports. What we read in the book of Kings is the following. Now Hiram, the king of Tyre, I pointed out that city is one of the Phoenician cities, sent his servants to Solomon when he heard that they had anointed him king in place of his father. For Hiram always loved Solomon. Actually, Hiram was in a sense related to the Israelites. His mother actually was from one of the tribes of Israel, from Naphtali. But Hiram and Solomon actually became very good friends. If you recall from the study of the Old Testament, it was Solomon that built the temple, not his father David. And what we read in this next verse here is that Solomon says, I propose to build a house for the name of my Lord, as the Lord has said to my father David, your son, whom I will set upon your throne, shall build a house for his name. Now, therefore, this is Solomon, now therefore, command that the cedars of Lebanon be cut for me. He's talking to Hiram. He's talking about the cedars of Lebanon. Well, we'll look at that in a moment. Have them cut. My servants will join your servants and will pay you wages for getting that timber to me. Here is one of the two pictures of Solomon and Hiram, and discussing the idea of building the temple. A little bit further on, and Solomon and Hiram said to Solomon, seeing I have heard the message you have sent me, I am ready to do all you desire in the matter of cypress and cypress timber. My servant shall bring it down from the sea from Lebanon, and I will make it into rafts and go by sea to the place that you direct, and have them broken up there, and you shall receive it. Well, Hiram supplied Solomon with timber in this manner. A little bit later, I'll mention the fact that Solomon gave different things to Hiram for doing this. However, move on to take a look at this situation that's involved here. It mentions in the book of Chronicles that Hiram was involved, and that cedars were taken from Lebanon and sent to Joppa. This is actually in the book of Chronicles, which does not have a lot of history, but it was something that was rather notorious, that deserved merit. Let's look at this map again. Here's Lebanon, way up here. The cedars of Lebanon were very sizable trees that grew up in a mountainous area. There were no trees of that sort in Palestine. Solomon wanted timber to be able to build an impressive temple. He would like to get that timber from way up here. This is about 100 miles or so. Let's take a look at that situation. Here's Lebanon way up here. Here's Israel down here. The cedars of Lebanon were up in this region, in this mountainous area, and all that Hiram had to do was to transport those cedars to Beirut. Well, Beirut was not there at that time, but in that area was one of those seaports, and then put them into the Mediterranean Sea. Now, why do that? Well, here's one picture of the cedars of Lebanon, but it doesn't show it quite as much as that. These were sizable things. Now, to transport these by land, as you can see, is a rather sizable effort. And what Hiram decided to do is that, hey, we can get those things down to Israel, but we don't have to do it over land. Let's just float it down. And that's exactly what he did. they made it into rafts. Now this happens to be a modern day raft, a modern day in which timber is being relocated. This is a real picture. I think this is from somewhere up near Lake Superior, and they were transporting lumber in huge quantities by water in the same way it was done in the Bible. Here is a very old picture, and you see all these logs in the water, and you see all these men here in rowboats escorting these logs. Now this is the way that Hiram may have transported all that lumber. We don't know, but it also mentions the fact that it was made into rafts, and it was transported in that way, and rafted all the way down that Mediterranean area, all the way from way up here, all the way down to Joppa. Now let's see what's done. Okay, and here was the port of Joppa during biblical days. Where was Joppa? If we take a look at a map of Israel, we'll find that Joppa was maybe about 30 or 40 miles from Israel. So they were able to get that timber from way up in Lebanon, way down in Israel, and not have to spend most of it traveling by land. Well, that's seafaring in a sense, a little bit different. These are a couple pictures of building the temple, and you can see why he needed lumber of a sizable quantity. A little bit later in the book of Kings, we read something else. King Solomon built a fleet of ships at Ezion-Geber, which is near Ethloth, on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom. Now, I remember a moment ago I was showing you where this was. We'll get back to that. And Hiram sent with the fleet his servants, seamen, who were familiar with the sea, and together with the servants of Solomon, they went out to Ophir and brought from there gold to the amount of 420 talents and brought it to King Solomon. All of a sudden we find a mutual effort between the king of Tyre and what is going on way down here in Ezion-Geber. Why should the king of Tyre be that interested in what is happening here in Ezion-Geber? Because of this very close relationship that probably he had with Solomon. We find out this whole area here that was under, in a sense, under the control of Solomon, that Solomon and Hiram were very good friends, and there didn't seem to be any difficulty in Hiram helping Solomon make use of the fleet of Ezion-Geber. This is a little bit further in that chapter, and it talks about the same thing, but talks about it a little bit differently. For the king had a fleet of ships of Tarshish at sea with the fleet of Hiram. Once every 3 years, the fleet of ships of Tarshish used to come bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. Now, in one of the previous slides, and I didn't point this out as well as I should have, there was a mention of something else. They went to Ophir, O-P-H-I-R, and it brought back gold. I'll talk a lot about that gold another time. But where is Ophir? We don't know. We don't know. In the same way, we don't really know where Tarsus was. Tarsus is a word. I'll give you everything that's said here. The Tarsus is a word in such connection that it seems reliable, not to refer to much as a destination or to signify to belonging with Tarshish, but suggestive of the nature of the ships, the size, and their far voyaging capabilities shown in these passages. Suggests that these ships of Tarshish were symbolic of Mediterranean trade, and the traders being well known in the Mediterranean Red Sea, carrying merchandise of great value. You will find in other places, Tarshish is sometimes referred to as Spain. It may be Spain, we don't really know, but very much in this book of Kings, they're talking about the fact that those ships went out to places where they could procure things. And they would bring those things back to Ezion-Geber and thereby make them available to the people in other ports. Here is this port of Ezion-Geber. This is This is the port of Ezion-Geber, things being brought in. Here's another picture of all the ships that we have out here, probably in the Gulf of Aqaba, the Gulf of Aqaba, I should say, which is joined to the Red Sea, bringing in, wow, what have they got here? They've got ivory. Let's take a look at another one of these pictures. Here's another picture, and you see evidences of pottery, probably of gold. One of my favorite pictures is this one. This happens to be a postage stamp. And it tells us about some of the things that were brought into Ezion-Geber. Remember that slide I had a while back about needs and wants? Well, here we have a couple of situations where we see some things that probably were wants, because peacocks and apes and ivory were not needs of the people in that part of the world, but they were the sort of things that could be brought into Ezion-Geber and thereby transported to these different locales. Here's another picture. There were any number of pictures that showed about this maritime effort that took place at this Ezion-Geber, which was an access to what? To the King's Highway, which was access to a good part of that part of the world that was not on the sea. Let's go back to Deborah's song here. In Deborah's song, it says that Dan was a place that had ships. Well, we just saw that. One instance, and for sure, was the fact that Joppa was the situation where all those cedars were brought. What about Asher? Let me show you something. It's hard to find, but right in here is Asher, and there is a little city called Acco. Akko. Akko it's called. And Akko is a seaport. In the Old Testament, the only reference to Akko is just one, and it shows up in Judges 1, and that is that in Asher, they did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko. It's never mentioned again. We never hear anything more about that city of Akko. But as far back as 1200 BC, Akko was probably still regarded as a seaport. History seems to indicate that probably in the third millennium, 3000 to 4000 BC, Akko might have been as important as Tyre or Sidon or some of the other. But by the time that the book of Judges was written, Akko was not even regarded as being an important seaport at all. Akko did show up under another name. Actually, it was one of the cities that apparently had been given to Hiram in payment for all the effort that he had made with Solomon. And it says that Hiram was disappointed in Akko. I won't say anything more about that. About 100 years or so after Solomon, we find that there was another effort to try to get involved in some maritime voyages. Now, the rest of the acts of Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat was a king of Judah. After Solomon, you recall the history of the Israelites. The Israelites split into the northern tribes and the southern tribes. Judah and Benjamin stayed in the south. All the other tribes went to the north. One of the northern tribes involved this King Ahab that we hear a lot about. A contemporary of Ahab in the south was Jehoshaphat. We learn only two things about this man Jehoshaphat. One was this: he was regarded as a good king. He was not regarded as evil as some of the other kings. And the other thing is that Jehoshaphat was involved with building ships to go from Tarshish to go to Ophir. Here we find out both Tarshish and Ophir mentioned in one verse, talking about what? Let's make ships that will go to places that will be able to bring us back some of the things we want, not necessarily the things that we may need. But the ships were wrecked. They never got off base. Jehoshaphat made ships of the Tarshish type to go to see, but they were wrecked, and we never hear anything more about it. That would seem to be pretty much the end of the maritime effort that we find on that coast. If you go back to that map, you'd find out that Judah was not on the coast at all, and it didn't make any difference. Turns out, however, that the Philistines were in that area, and the Philistines did have one port, Ashkelon, which came out from that area. But it was just those two locales, Joppa and way up there in Asher. Otherwise, what was true about Palestine? It was not going to be able to make any maritime effort. It made a partial maritime effort, you might say, through Joppa. I might mention, and we'll come across this a little later in one of the lessons, that Joppa is mentioned in another place. Anybody here want to try to volunteer? It is the seaport that Jonah left from when he went to try to get away from what God had commanded him to do. Otherwise, we don't hear anything more about Joppa. Here's an abbreviation. Now we're going to jump about 50 years or so before the birth of Christ. Do we have anything in the Old Testament with regard to that? The answer is no. Although parts of the book of Daniel may have been written a little bit before this time, but 50 years or so before the birth of Christ, there's nothing in the Old Testament. There are some references to what we're going to talk about in the New Testament. But this was the era when Herod the Great was the king of Palestine. Let's just very quickly look at what we remember about Herod. He died before Christ was actually born. Herod the Great was known as the what? As the man who put out the edict that all the babies in Bethlehem were to be destroyed. The slaughter of the innocents. Herod was regarded as a very evil man. Actually, I can remember reading an article that rather surprised me about Herod, about how he had drowned two of his nephews or great-nephews in a swimming pool, and they drowned them because he feared that they were possible contenders for his throne. That particular story was followed by the fact that Herod died soon after, and Herod was not regarded as necessarily being any more evil than most of the kings and the rulers of that era. And when you were king, one way to hang on to the throne was to do what? Kill off anybody that might be a threat to you. And Herod was no worse than some of the others. And actually, in some ways, Herod was better than some of the kings. One of the things that made Herod distinguished is that he was very interested in building. If you go to the New Testament, you find out at one point Jesus remarks about the temple that was being built. The temple that was being built was the temple of Herod. Herod was rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, and it became a very important landmark as far as the Israelites were concerned. Herod also built other things, and one of the things that he built was Caesarea Maritima. Caesarea Maritima. Let's take a look at this next map. Here is the map of Palestine. Here is Joppa. Here is Jerusalem. Here is Caesarea. It's right on the Mediterranean. Now, what do we know about Caesarea? Well, we know that Caesarea seemed to have been a place that people did not mind going to at certain times of the year because it was very pleasant to be on the Mediterranean shore. And Herod took it upon himself to move to Caesarea in one regard, to have a summer palace in Caesarea, or a spring palace. And he had the city of Caesarea built up. Herod the Great, he was a Roman client. Remember I think we talked about how he was appointed by the Romans, known for his building and the construction of the port of Caesarea Maritima. Let's take a look at that port. Well, I'm going to show you a picture of it before we discuss this. Here's a picture of that port. This is a picture of what Caesarea Maritima looked like. Here's the city of Caesarea. Around here somewhere is that palace that Herod had built. This is all unnatural. These are all things that Herod had done to create a port within the region of Caesarea. This previous slide goes into the breakwaters. Those breakwaters that I showed, those slides, were made of lime and pozzolana, whatever that is, a volcanic ash. The reason that those seem to hold back water, and he was able that way to make these great big piers that stretched out all the way from land in this fashion. There's another place where it talks about one way of building up those piers right out of the sea was not only to transport that volcanic ash and lime, but actually to take ships or barges filled with rocks and sink them right at the proper location and slowly build up a pier which kept the Mediterranean from actually getting into that locale. And do it in 2 different places, 3 different places, and have a port. And this became the port referred to as Caesarea Maritima. Actually, it turned out to be one of the most important and significant ports that we have in the Mediterranean during the Christian era. Oops. Here's another picture of that port. We find out that there was quite a bit of shipping that went out from that region. And some of it still came from Joppa, but an awful lot of it actually starts out in Caesarea Maritima. So it's kind of interesting looking at the maritime efforts of the Israelites because they're so little and it's scattered in so many different places. If you think that this particular lesson was somewhat disjointed, it is, because it's disjointed in my mind too, because I had to find it in different places and not set up in a nice simple order. But it's kind of interesting the effect that the maritime efforts had on the history of Israel, particularly coming through Solomon and his association with Hiram, who was associated with some of the most successful people as far as any maritime efforts in the world at that particular time. Now there's one thing that I haven't mentioned and did not go into in any extent at all, is part of the things that were being transported. I talked about the peacocks, or showed the peacocks, and I showed the apes, and I showed the ivory. But anybody notice something else that was mentioned once in one of the slides? Gold. This became a rather significant part of the history of Israel. Not soon, maybe in a few weeks of time, I'm going to talk about the effect of gold on the history of Israel. We're going to take a look at the actual temple that was built by Solomon and find out that so much of it involved so much gold in so many different places. I'm not going to say too much more about this except one thing, that this gold did not come from the gold mines in Palestine. You know why? There were none. There was no gold in Palestine. All the gold that we read about in Palestine and in the temple had to be imported. And a large portion of it was imported through this place, Ezion Geber, that I had mentioned. It was imported probably from places like Ophir, wherever that was. It was a source of gold. Maybe from Africa. South Africa has long been a source of gold. And what had to happen is that gold had to be imported to provide the gold that Solomon needed for his temple. A question that might arise is this: how did Solomon pay for this gold? Where did that money come from? Well, he paid for part of it by giving away some of the cities that we talked about that he gave to Hiram. But he paid for it another way. He paid for it by trading off something he did have. And you know what that was? Copper. He had plenty of copper. And if you think there was a lot about gold in the temple, wait till we read about all the copper and discuss then where did all this copper come from. In the future, one of the lessons that I'm getting together, and don't dare get into it at the present time, are the mining efforts that took place in the world at that time, and how it made possible for things like gold to be transported in the quantities that it was to bring it to Palestine, and about copper, I'm sure that most of you heard stories about King Solomon's mines, and think about all the gold and everything that was associated with King Solomon. It was not gold. What were King Solomon's mines? And this becomes very significant in the history of that part of the world. They were copper mines. So sometime in the future, I'll be giving a lesson just on the mining efforts that were involved in the world at that time. And how much of this does center on what? The ability to transport stuff over water readily and to get from long distances without an awful lot of effort. That's about it for today. Thank you, Lauren. Okay, folks.